Hello everybody and welcome to our discussion, our conversation on better managing our lives within this climate and seeing what we can do as individuals and as a collective too to better manage this earth on whom we depend. My name is Verity James and I am so delighted to be the facilitator for our forum tonight. This is going to be a real learning experience. It's a real opportunity for every single person here. And I suspect even for the climate commissioners too, because they're here to listen to your concerns, to your questions, as well as share their amazing knowledge. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Noongar people, on whose land we meet today, and thank them for their custodianship over so many centuries. And our climate commissioners today will be, of course, Professor Tim Flannery. Also, yes, feel free. Cheering is acceptable as well. Also, Professor Leslie Hughes. Professor Will Stephan. And Dr. Susanna Elliott. And you'll get to find out a little bit more about them and why they've taken on this incredible role in a short while from now. Look, I'd really like to thank you so much for coming out on what's probably freezing outside at the moment, is it? Whenever it drops. No? Yeah. Well, it certainly was today, coming down from Perth, you know, with the hail and the rain and all of that sort of thing. So I love that you have come out tonight. It just shows how much you care about the future, that you really want to take part in this constructive conversation. Clearly, as I mentioned, we have an intelligent audience and I hope a courteous audience. Now, these climate issues, as we know, evoke passions like almost nothing else, and they should. This is about our very existence. This is about what our planet is going to look like, about our survival. And that passion acknowledged, I really do want you to address this in a civilised fashion, as I'm sure you will. I'm glad you came to take part in this conversation, but as much as I love you and care for you, I will evict you if you get out of hand. In a very loving, caring kind of way, though. Now, as we know, WA is a very different part of the world to the rest of the world. I always think we are so different, and we have very specific climate issues here that the climate commissioners will deal with too. You'll hear about that very shortly too, but we've got a whole heap of things on our plate that we need to make some decisions about, but that we also need to learn about before we can make those decisions. So soon you'll hear about their research, and then they'll happily take some brief questions. Just before I bring Professor Tim Flannery back into it, I'll just give you the heads up now. We would like brief questions. There are a lot of you here tonight, and obviously we want to get through as many questions as we possibly can. So we don't want statements, we want some questions so that we can really get into the discussion and learn so much more. So let's now introduce the man I know is a fan, or is the star to many of you anyway, Professor Tim Flannery. He's the Chief Climate Commissioner. He's one of Australia's leading writers, of course, on climate change. He is an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer, conservationist. Professor Flannery was named Australian of the Year in 2007. Yes. And as I remember, I think you immediately turned to the then Prime Minister and said, "Don't expect me to agree with you on everything." He's held various academic positions, including Professor at the University of Adelaide, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum, Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University, and the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. I've got it underlined to say it properly. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please help me make Professor Tim Flannery very welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Verity, for that introduction. It's embarrassed me slightly, actually. But it's fantastic to be here with you this evening. We're really pleased to see so many people out on what is a pretty chilly, windy evening, and appreciate you coming here. This really is your evening, because the Climate Commission is set up to help provide, well, to engage with you, really, to engage with the Australian public. The Climate Commission was originally, it resulted from a promise by the federal government to set such a body up. And we're a bit peculiar, and I just want to take a few moments to explain what we do and what we don't do. We are independent from government, so we don't do the government's bidding and we don't report back to government. We're a bit like, I suppose, the judiciary or the Reserve Bank or whatever, in that we're funded by the government, but we don't, we're independent of them. We decided early on that we wouldn't comment on government policy, nor opposition policy, because there's a million opinions out there and you can get them anytime you turn on a TV or radio on issues of policy. We saw little point in doing that, and we thought that if we gave away really the power to comment on policy, what we hoped to gain was the authority to be heard as a credible, independent voice in terms of this climate issue. And that's what's really important in the longer term. The Climate Commission's view about this is that this issue is going to be with us for many decades, and that in a democracy, the only way that we'll be able to deal with these problems successfully is if we have a well-educated public who understands the issues and who can make the right sorts of decisions. So we have a rather long-term view of that. We're not focused so much on policy. You can ask questions about policy, but we may not be able to answer them, at least in that direct way. So that's what we do. That's who we are, rather. We have three basic products. We have a website, we have reports, and we'll be presenting one of our reports to you this evening. Professor Will Stephan has produced a report called The Critical Decade, which deals with the science of climate change, and we'll give you an overview of that. That report really underlines another aspect of the way we work. We understand the importance of bipartisanship in the climate issue for a number of reasons, and when we presented our science report to the Australian Federal Parliament on May 23rd this year, it did receive bipartisan support. Both major parties recognised it as being the basis, the proper basis, scientific basis from which to deal with this issue. And that's just, it is hugely important. Every time you get that sort of support, you get so much more certainty, so much more community buy-in, and so much more acceptance of the message. So one of the things we try to do is work in that way. Just take the most reputable, authoritative material and reflect that in the things that we convey to the public. We also, of course, do forums like this. Typically, we'll turn up in a region, we'll go out and visit a business, we might have a business breakfast, we might meet the Lions Club, we might meet people from a school or a university, and then come on to a forum like this. And by the time we arrive at the forum, we've usually got a fairly good idea about what's happening in the local community. Unfortunately, our schedule this time hasn't permitted us to visit a business in the Bunbury area prior to this meeting, but we do look forward to hearing from you about business perspectives in terms of the climate issue. I'd like to just say a few more words about our climate commissioners who are here and ask them to really introduce themselves for you, but also to introduce one of our visitors. Bruce Thom, Professor Bruce Thom, is in the audience here. Bruce is travelling with us at the moment. He's the chair of the federal government's Coastal Climate Committee, and is an expert in areas of sea level rise and so forth. So if you have any questions in that area, Professor Thom, I'm sure, will be happy to answer them. We have two commissioners who are not with us this evening. Unfortunately, Jerry Houston, who has recently stepped down as the president of BP Australasia. He's one of our commissioners. He's stuck in Queenstown in a blizzard, trying to drink his way out of it, as we understand, with some good Pinot Noir. But yes, we wish him the best in that. And Roger Beale, our economist, who was last seen in the East India Club in London, dispensing advice there over a gin and tonic, but he's with us for most of our events, but unfortunately can't be with us this evening. The three commissioners who are here are Susanna Elliott at the end here, and Susanna is an expert in really science communication. And I thought I'd just ask you, as I introduce you all, why you joined the Commission. How did you get involved with the climate issue? So perhaps one after the other you could...
Well, you asked me, Tim.
Yes.
That was... Now, I think for me, you know, I'm actually a bit of a generalist, really. I'm working across lots of different fields of science. It might be vaccinations one day, it might be climate change the next. And, you know, I just realised that there was a huge scientific consensus in climate science, which I felt wasn't getting through. And so I felt that that message really needed to get through, and that's really why I joined the Commission.
Okay, thanks. And I know, Will, you've got a particular path to get to where you've got to, and you are, I should say for the audience, one of the most respected climate scientists on the planet. And at ANU, how did you end up getting involved with things?
Yeah, well, it actually goes way back to my childhood. I was born and raised in the middle of America, which you'll probably find out fairly quickly if you haven't already from my accent. And we lived in a fairly small, poor town out in Iowa. And we had one, in the 3 years I was in high school, we had one school excursion. And the one school excursion was to an abattoir in Sioux City, Iowa. So I thought, I've got to get out of this place and do something different with my career. And so I ended up down here at ANU way back in the 1970s, then CSIRO. But one of the things that really struck me was when I was working on an international program about 15 years or so ago on climate change, I started to see the first evidence coming in from the ice cores of what the climate has done in the past. And then I looked at where we might be going in the future, and I said, oh my goodness, this looks like we could be headed into something as drastic as an ice age, but in the opposite direction. This is a pretty serious issue. So after that, I became really interested in communicating it, working on the policy aspects and so on. That eventually took me to the Commission.
Great. I must say it's an awesome thought that abattoir work was it was what drove you into climate science, but there we go. Anyway, look, our final commissioner who's with us this evening is Professor Leslie Hughes from Macquarie University. Leslie's an expert on adaptation and impacts of climate change on biodiversity. And again, I'd just be really interested to hear why you got into the area, Leslie.
Well, I did my PhD actually on ants and ant behaviour, and after 4 years of following ants around the bush, I was pretty over that, and I was casting around, believe it or not, I know, hard to believe, I was casting around for something else to work on, and my PhD supervisor at the time, and this was about 20 years ago, said, you know, I think climate change might be an interesting issue, and I thought, yeah, that might be something in that. And that was 20 years ago, and I've been working in climate change ecology ever since, and it's one of those topics that once you get into it, it becomes almost a moral imperative to stay in it, because when I first started working on climate change, the impacts of climate change on biodiversity seem to be a long way off, and it's become very apparent in the last decade that they're actually here with us now, so that's why I've stayed in it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my journey to being in this is, I guess, a bit similar to all of yours. I started off in paleontology and modern mammals in the Pacific Islands, and I remember climbing mountain after mountain in Papua New Guinea because I was really interested in the things that lived right in the alpine grassland on the top of the mountain. And I noticed that no matter which mountain I climbed, I saw the same thing, that the tree line was rising, the vegetation was coming up. And I was stupid enough not to actually sort of twig to this, that this was a real fingerprint of climate change. I just thought, oh, perhaps people are burning the grasslands differently or something. And it was only when I got back to Australia, it was some years later, that I, through different circumstances, started to read the scientific literature and thought, well, how could I have been so stupid that as a trained scientist I hadn't actually saw that this was the key issue? And since I made that realisation and read the literature, papers written by people like Will Stephan and Leslie, a bit like them, I've realised that it is the issue of our age, and it's the sort of thing you engage in now or never, because this is the critical decade. This is the time we have to actually go forward and try to address the issue. Having said that, I think we should turn to Will now, and he will give you a bit of an overview of his report, The Critical Decade. It's, I think, a great piece of science, and thank you, Will, for taking us through it.
Right. Thank you very much, Tim. What I'm going to do is just give you a very quick climate change 101, the basics, and then turn it over to Leslie, who's going to talk to the impacts on Western Australia, which will be of much more interest to you, I think. But let's get started. The first question you ask is the climate really changing? And here's some data. This is the one that everyone looks at. This is air temperature around the globe, globally averaged from 1880, you see on the left, to 2010, last year on the right. And you can see that there are lots of ups and downs in there. One year isn't automatically warmer than the next year or colder than the next year. But you can see that there's a very strong underlying trend through the last century, and particularly from about 1960 or 1970, the temperature has been rising quite steadily. And we can look at that in terms of the rate. It's 0.2 of a degree Celsius per decade. Doesn't sound like much when you look at it from the aspect of a human lifetime, but when you look at it from a geological time span, that's a very rapid rate of change. But interestingly, scientists actually don't spend a lot of time on that, even though it's an enormous amount of interest in the media and so on. We actually look at that graph. Now that's a graph of ocean temperature, and the reason we do that is that most of the extra heat, nearly 90% of it at the Earth's surface, actually doesn't stay in the air, it goes into the ocean. Ocean covers 70% of the Earth's surface. Water has a much higher heat capacity than air does. So here we look from 1950, when we first had good measurements of ocean temperature, again to 2010, a very clear trend, ocean temperatures going up. You may have heard some people say, well, warming has stopped the last decade. Well, no, it hasn't. There's the ocean temperature. Look at the year 2000, look at the year 2010. It's going up, and that's where most of the heat is going. And we have other evidence too. Here's just one other piece. This jagged red line shows the rate at which sea ice is being lost up around the North Pole. This is the so-called Arctic sea ice, and it's diminishing at a very fast rate. It's possible that we could see an ice-free Arctic Ocean by the middle of this century, and indeed, countries up there are scrambling to declare sovereignty over the open waters and the resources underneath them. Russia's actually planted a metal Russian flag down under the North Pole already. The black line there that goes out to 2100, of course, isn't an observation because it hasn't happened yet. That's a model. So here's an example where a climate model is too conservative. It's predicting we still have sea ice at 2100. Well, we almost surely will not. So I could keep going on, but I won't. So the first point is, yes, the climate is changing, and indeed it's warming, and it's warming at a very rapid rate. Scientists actually use a plain English word to describe that. We use the word unequivocal, which means there isn't any doubt about what's happening. So having established, and we've established this actually for quite a few decades, the question is, why is this occurring? Is this really natural variability and therefore we can't do anything about it? Or is there a human imprint in the warming that we see? So let's turn to that question. And what I want to do here is go back to some very fundamental physics. We've known about the greenhouse effect since the 1800s. In fact, the first measurement of it was done in the laboratory around 1850 or so by John Tyndall, a British scientist, when he measured exactly what wavelengths CO2 absorbed. Why is that important? Well, the energy that powers our planet comes from the sun. That's what drives life. That's what supports life on planet. That's what drives atmospheric and ocean circulation. But the Earth, to keep a balance, has to give away energy to balance the energy coming in. Now, it doesn't do this by emitting light. We don't shine like a star. We emit heat back out into space, and that's a different wavelength. That's where the gases come in. There's a belt of so-called greenhouse gases around the lower atmosphere. When you fly in an airplane over to the east, you're above that belt of greenhouse gases. And they let all the sunlight come through, but they intercept and absorb some of the heat that goes out, because it's a different wavelength. That's basic physics. And when they do that, they release that heat back out in all directions, so some of it comes back down to the surface and gives you extra heat at the Earth's surface. Well-known physical phenomenon since the 1800s. We can quantify it. That is, we can tell you by how much temperature will go up given a given increase in greenhouse gases. Now, I'll just show you how scientists actually test this mathematically. This next one is a trend line that you can't see yet. It goes from the year 1900 to the year 2000, so it's actually in the past. It's already happened. So what we can do is test our knowledge and test our models. So we can say, is this natural variability? Well, what are the things that drive natural variability in climate? Well, the sun actually changes a little bit in the amount of energy it sends in. That certainly changes the climate. And volcanoes emit a lot of stuff into the atmosphere, and that can change the climate. So let's put those in the models and ask the models to say what should have happened last century, and there it is. There is natural variability. Temperature does go up and down, and we know that quite well. But then we also know we've put a lot of extra greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, particularly since the Second World War, and we've measured those, so we know how much they are. So let's tell our model, our climate model, let's put in the extra greenhouse gases. What should temperature do? This is quite an interesting graph. Let me show you what happens. There we go. Look, there's not much change till 1950, and that's because there weren't many greenhouse gases, extra greenhouse gases, until after 1950. Now we have a split between those two lines. We can actually test our understanding of the climate system. We've got observations. This has already happened. So which line that the model predicts agrees? So let's send our scientists out from the Bureau of Meteorology in Melbourne and from other bureaus of meteorology, and this is what they measure. That's what actually occurred in terms of global average temperature. So the model is dead on. It's got it absolutely right. but only if you put the extra greenhouse gases in, and the most important of those is CO2. Now again, I could go on for hours with all sorts of other evidence. This isn't the only piece of evidence. There's many other pieces of evidence to tell us that this is a greenhouse gas-driven warming and not natural variability. So these are two things that are well understood. There is no debate at all in the scientific community about them, that the planet's warming, and the main cause of that since the middle of last century are the extra greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. You may see debates in the blogs, you may see debates in the media, but you do not see a debate in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. This has been known for a couple of decades. Well, what does this mean? Well, the most important thing, or one of the most important things, I think, is it changes the way extreme events happen and how serious they are. Extreme events are heat waves, things like bushfires, heavy rainfall events, and so on. This little graph shows you that if you have any climate parameter, say temperature, you have an average temperature, but you have some very low temperatures and some very high temperatures around that average. It isn't 27 degrees every day if the average temperature is 27 degrees in January. You get some that are 17 and some that are 35, but the average is 27. Now you might think a 1 degree change in average isn't very much, but if we apply a 1 degree average or a small change in the average, you get a big shift in the extreme. Look at that right-hand tail, as we call it. So you get many more hot days and some that are unusually record hot. The example of this is Melbourne in 2009 when they recorded 46.4, which was easily a record by a couple of degrees, way outside what they had ever experienced before. That would not have happened without that underlying trend in temperature. And we design our infrastructure for a given temperature range. There's the example of an urban transport system. The Melbourne transport system, that's an actual photo of it during that heat wave, the rails buckled because they were not designed for 46 degrees Celsius. An interesting other thing to say is that the human body has evolved between ice ages and warm periods. It's not evolved for any temperatures higher than what we're experiencing today. That's the highest we've ever experienced as humans. So there's a real question about whether our physiology will handle the climate that might be coming our way. Well, that's some basics on climate. I want to turn it over now to my colleague Leslie Hughes, who will bring it right down to Western Australia and talk about some issues here.
Thanks, Will. Well, let's get a bit more local now. And the report that we released today is a supplement to the original Critical Decade report that identifies the regional impacts for Western Australia with a particular emphasis on the southwest. Okay, well, temperatures in Western Australia have gone up about 0.8 of a degree over the last century, and this is very consistent with temperatures across Australia and indeed across other parts of the world. You all are very aware here that southwest Western Australia has had declining rainfall. Northwest Western Australia, however, has been getting a lot wetter, and if you look at the rainfall over the entire state, it's increased. But where most of the people live and where most of the agriculture in the state is in the southwest, and that's been getting a lot drier. Indeed, we've had here a 15% decline in rainfall since the mid-70s, and it happened very abruptly in about 1975. There was a dramatic decrease in rainfall, and it has stayed low since that time. And a 15% drop in rainfall has actually translated into a 40% drop in the stream flow going into the Perth water supply because of the effect on runoff. So what that top graph shows, and it's a little bit faint, if you just look at the horizontal bars, the first horizontal bar, that red one, shows the average runoff into the Perth water supply from 1911 to 1975. The second bar, that sort of light bluey purple bar, is the runoff between 76 and the year 2000 or so. The third bar is between 2000 and about 2006, and then the fourth bar is the time since then. The numbers at the bottom show the average runoff in gigalitres over 3 periods into the Perth water supply. So 177 gigalitres per year between 75 and the year 2000 on average, down to just under 60 gigalitres for the period 2006 to 2010. It was only 13 gigalitres in the year 2010. The impacts on biodiversity, which of course is my research area, potentially in the future are very, very great in this area. The southwest of Western Australia is a very special place. I'm sure you're all aware of it. It's one of the internationally recognised biodiversity hotspots in the world. And the reason it's considered a biodiversity hotspot is that it has thousands of species here that only occur here, that evolved here, and most endemic species that evolved here have very small ranges. They're only found in a very small range of habitats, and that predisposes them to being vulnerable to a rapidly changing climate. So the biodiversity here is at risk, and we do modelling of the potential impact of climate change on biodiversity, and it consistently indicates that the suitable habitat for many, many species in the southwest of Western Australia will decline quite precipitously in the future. Sea levels are rising globally. Since the 1990s, they've risen about 3.2 millimetres per year across the globe on average, but in southwest Western Australia, you are getting sea level rises that are bigger than almost anywhere else in Australia. They've been rising since the 1990s at a rate of over 7 millimetres a year. Now, sea level rise in and of itself is important, but when combined with potential flooding from intense rainfall events, it puts coastal infrastructure, roads, rail, buildings and sandy beaches at considerable risk. I want to end with this slide. Our report released earlier this year was called The Critical Decade, really because of what's shown in this slide. So the first part of that slide, that wiggly black line, is the temperature rise that we've had so far that Will showed at the beginning of his talk. And the red area and the blue area represent two possible potential futures for the planet. The blue area is the range of temperatures that we may experience if we are able to abate our greenhouse gas emissions very seriously to keep temperatures below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level. That 2 degrees is sort of seen as the guardrail above which a lot of dangerous climate change may occur. The red area is what we call the business as usual scenario. You'll notice that it's a very wide area. There's a lot of uncertainty about the estimates, but the main thing about the estimates is that it's predicting very, very substantial increases in temperature. Now, of course, scientists like Will and I deal with graphs all the time. We love graphs, but to people who are not scientists, graphs are, pretty impersonal. So I want to actually make this a lot more personal. I was born in the 1960s, and if I live to the average age of 85, I hope I live that long, that bar there represents the mean annual temperature that I will experience over my lifetime on this earth. I've got 2 teenage children born in the mid-90s, and if they live till they're about 85, that bar there represents the mean annual temperature that they will experience over their lifetime under a business as usual scenario. Now, I don't have grandchildren yet, but assuming I get some when my kids turn around about 30, if they have kids, that bar there represents the mean annual temperature that they will experience under a business as usual scenario over their lifetime. So the challenge that we have is to turn this around and to try to keep temperatures below that 2 degrees level so that my grandkids, your great-grandkids have a future. Thank you. I'll leave it there and I'll hand it back over to Tim.
Thank you. That's great. I'm going to close. We're anxious to hear from you and have your questions, so I'm going to close with just 2 slides that deal with just a few of the key issues for the future. What we've found as we go around speaking to businesses, particularly around Australia, is that the need for business certainty is very, very great. Businesses would like an environment that's fair, equitable, and that gives them certainty for future investments. And that's particularly true in the energy sector, where they'll often spend billions of dollars on infrastructure that'll pay back over 50 or so years. So business certainty is important, and bipartisan policy is particularly important in terms of delivering that certainty. As we look at pricing pollution, so we get a shift away from heavily polluting sources to others, this is effectively the way the system works. You place a price on the source of pollution, and then industries, they have a choice. They can either reduce their pollution or they can pay the price. This sort of approach to dealing with pollution issues it's really one of the foundation blocks of our civilization. You can't even have a village of 100 people living together unless they deal with their pollution, yeah? And that always involves a cost, even if that cost is walking over and brushing the rubbish out into the local creek or whatever it is, right? So, and we wouldn't have our civilization as it is today if people hadn't paid that cost. We'd still be ankle deep in sewerage and have unbreathable air. Yeah? So this is part of a continuum in terms of how we deal with these issues. So the costs are passed on, particularly in a modern industrial society like ours, to businesses and households, and they've also got a choice. They can reduce their consumption or make low emission choices in terms of the technologies they deploy and so forth. The outcome of all of that is that you get pollution reduced and you get investment in clean energy and in energy efficiency. And that's the start. It's one tool that's used by governments in terms of dealing with this issue. There are also taxes, there's also regulation, there's a whole lot of other approaches, but this is one particular approach that has been used in various parts of the world, particularly Europe. Wherever we've gone around Australia, we've found that there's a great interest in regional communities in the opportunities that'll be unlocked as that model unfolds, as communities can start to generate their own energy solutions. You've got here a big solar array, and there's a system like this being built in Australia over the next few years. In terms of built infrastructure, in terms of biofuels and so forth, there really is an enormous interest we've found. I was rather surprised actually the extent of the interest wherever we go around Australia, and there's some really good examples of communities that have already taken advantage of these opportunities. One that sticks with me is concerns Mackay in Queensland, which we visited a month or two ago. There, a sugar refiner had taken their waste product to generate electricity, and we're generating about 40 megawatts of electricity. That's about a third the electricity requirements of the city of Mackay. So, and for that business it was tremendously important because the sugar industry is very unforgiving. There's a global price for sugar. The Brazilians are very, very effective in the way they sell into that market, so everyone else gets a pretty rough ride. And for them, for the sugar refiners at Mackay, having this second leg, if you want, to their business enterprise was tremendously important. It only came about, that investment, by the way, because of the mandated renewable energy target. It's a bipartisan policy, been in place for several years now, that says that 20% of the nation's energy will come from renewable resources by 2020. So good policy can unlock these sort of opportunities for regional economies, and I'll be very interested to hear actually this evening whether there's any initiatives in this area which are being pursued. I think that's pretty much the end. There's issues here about what we can do as individuals and communities and so forth. Probably best to pursue these in question time because I'm sure that there's lots of opportunities here people will want to share as we take questions. So I think it's time to hand over to you now, Verity, and perhaps take some questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you to all of our commissioners for giving us a little bit of a discussion about their specific areas. So, if you want to put up your hands, I just want to ask one question before we go any further, and it's to Leslie. Do I have to call you Professor Your Godship? No. To Leslie, what is it that is making Western Australia more affected by the sea than other parts of the world? Why is it that we're having such a big impact?
Well, I'm going to pass that question on to Professor Tom over there, who is an expert on sea level rise. So
brilliant. If we could have a microphone, could you stand up, please, Professor Tom?
As Tim said, I chair the National Coast and Climate Change Council. The question of sea level rise is a very interesting one because most people think of the sea as just something flat, but it's not. The sea has lots of bumps in it, and those bumps changing their position around the globe, around the seas, and particularly in relationship to the heating of the ocean. Because as Will showed, in the marvellous diagram that Will showed, was an averaging of the global temperature of the ocean. But different parts of the ocean are differently heated. Now, Leslie also showed, I think, a diagram which showed a great big red area down the Western Australian coast. That was for last summer, and that showed how hot the Western Australian coast got last summer. That also would have coincided with a slightly higher level of the ocean compared to the cooler parts. It also coincided with a bleaching event of the Ningaloo Reef. And because the temperatures went over, I think, 26.5 degrees for a number of days, that bleached the reef. That means that when you get those sorts of phenomena, the sea itself is a very, very mobile thing. Now, averaged out over long periods of time, you start to get these figures of these rates of rise. But why do we get such a high rate of rise on the Western Australian coast, particularly in the southwest at the moment? We're not sure. This is where the uncertainties come in. It's very hard to explain a lot of these regional differences. I've given you one sort of general feel for it, but we as Australians do not have the specific details on this that we would like to have. And particularly this is relevant for planning purposes. When we're looking at land use planning, we're looking at where we keep people, properties, infrastructure out of harm's way along the coastal zone. We have to know what these rates are. And that's the difficult thing that we have to face today. We have to be able to better understand those changes over time. Thank you.
All right. If you'd like to put up your hands, if you have a question, then certainly we'll try to get to as many people in the room as we can. I'd like to start here with the lady in the red. Would you like to stand up and we'll get a microphone to you?
I'm Bronwyn Mutton from the Cable LCDC, and there's two parts to the question. One, has research shown that climate and rainfall is affected by widespread vegetation clearing? And if so, should there be more regulation to prevent continued widespread clearing of the remnant vegetation to protect this marvellous, magnificent biodiversity in the southwest?
Thank you very much for that question. Well,
I'll take part one and Leslie part two.
okay.
Yes, clearing forests can have an effect on rainfall, but let's be clear, the major effect are changes in atmosphere and ocean circulation. That's the main driver of the change you see in southwest WA. But it is exacerbated or increased a bit by the fact that you've cleared a landscape. So it does have an effect, but most of the changes we see in rainfall around the world, including the southwest WA one, are dominated by atmospheric oceanic circulation changes, not by the clearing of land.
But to answer the second part of your question, yes, we should definitely, from my point of view, be stopping land clearing everywhere. In the southwest, about 75% of native vegetation has been cleared, mainly for agricultural but also urban settlements. And that's had a big impact on biodiversity before climate change started to have an impact. So I think there's all sorts of good reasons both to reduce the existing stresses on biodiversity, to put carbon back into the landscape by growing trees rather than clearing them, but certainly restoring vegetation, and there are some excellent restoration programs going on in the southwest, such as the Gondwana Links program, is part of the adaptation solution to climate change.
Can we in fact just be encouraging farmers perhaps not just to grow, although God knows you've got some of the best milk in this area and wonderful things that you grow too, but should we just be encouraging people to replant that same native vegetation so that whole farmlands in fact can be viable for the farmer as well, but it's native vegetation that will encourage the greater diversity to continue?
You've actually hit on quite a controversial topic.
Oops.
Unwittingly, I suppose. Yes, we should be replanting native vegetation. We shouldn't necessarily be planting exactly the same species that were there before, because some of those species will now find it climatically unsuitable. So we need to be thinking very clearly about, if we want to restore landscapes in a sustainable way, we need to be planting species that will be sustained in those landscapes under a changed climate. and that's not necessarily a straightforward matter.
No, it wouldn't be, but surely if we're trying to prevent the temperature from going up, and if we are successful at doing that, then we can keep the species that we had before.
Oh, sure. It's a question of timescale.
Okay.
Planting trees is part of a climate change solution, but it's not going to work that quickly.
Okay, thank you.
My name's Alec Piper, and I'm a resident of Banksia Street in Bunbury. Professor Stephan said that the evidence is unequivocal, and I think everyone agrees it's unequivocal that we have climate change. What is not unequivocal is whether it's caused by mankind. And he says that all the real scientists agree. Now, I can quote him 3 professors.
Are you actually asking a question, or
the question is, what does Professor Stephan say about Professor Spencer? Professor Spencer, who was one of the founding members of the IPCC and pulled out because of the alarmists, and Professor Spencer says that the clouds are more important than CO2 in forming global warming.
Okay,
and that El Nino is a bigger effect. Professor Solby, who's Professor of Climate Change at Professor Flannery's University, just recently has said that climate change, we've got temperature rises and CO2 rises, but the temperature rises have caused the CO2 rises.
Okay, so effectively your question is it human-based or not? Because
yeah,
you're saying that there's
lots
other
of evidence that it's not human-based.
Well, let's get a response. Thank you for your question. Let's get a response.
Thanks for that question. First, a few clarifications. Roy Spencer wasn't a founder of the IPCC. He has contributed to it. He's a satellite temperature expert. And indeed, he has made some comments about satellites.
Excuse me.
Excuse
me, sir. You have actually asked your question. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just resuming your seat and getting a response. Thank you.
Yeah, look, the Spencer temperature record is a satellite-based record. Once the corrections were made for the satellite drift, it agreed very well with the graph that I showed you, and Roy Spencer himself has acknowledged that. The point I was trying to make is when you go into the scientific peer-reviewed literature, the overwhelming evidence is that the major factor driving the climate shifts that we've seen since the middle of the last century is indeed the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. Clouds are an amplifier or a dampening factor. They're included in the models. The models apparently get it pretty right because they measure the observed, model the observed temperature pretty right. So in my view, if you wanted to put an absolute number on it, I would say the percentage of scientists who actually publish in the peer-reviewed literature who would agree with the statements I made would be somewhere around 97 or 98%, which is about as close as you're going to get to a consensus on a complex issue like this.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Leslie? Yes?
Somebody who's my colleague at Macquarie University and Tim's Professor Solby. Murray Solby did give a talk the other day, in fact 2, where he presented some quite controversial views. He has not released the data on which that was presented. The data has not been published. When and if that data is published, it will be subject to peer review and we will be in a better position to assess it. But at the moment he has refused to release the data on which he claims his views are based.
And there's a whole academic tradition, isn't there, about if it is not published and it is not reviewed, then it's basically not accepted. Is that right?
At that point, it's still opinion, and there's lots of opinions.
Exactly.
Sorry, Tim.
No, I think it's worth just clarifying a little bit about this peer review process, because it's something we hear a lot about, but it's not widely understood. I've published about 140 scientific papers in my life, and the process, I know it pretty well. You write your paper up, you send it to a journal editor, and the journal editor, of course, the journal only has one asset, which is its reputation. If it publishes bad science, no one's going to read it, no library's going to buy it, it'll collapse and die. So what the journal editor does to protect the reputation of the journal is send that paper you've submitted to the most ferocious critics he can find, the people who'll do the most, the best job of really going through it carefully. And that's called the peer review process. And they'll go through it and make sure all the figures add up, make sure that it's consistent with previous research in the area, make sure that the basic physics and chemistry are all obeyed. It's like an auditing process for a set of books in a business, So once you've got those audited books effectively, that peer-reviewed basis in the literature. It's still hard for anyone to build a bigger picture of what's happening with climate change, because we've got the blocks, we're building blocks, but we haven't seen the whole edifice yet. What happens is then a group like the IPCC or the Australian Academy of Sciences takes all of those bits and puts out a statement, or in the case of the IPCC, a major report, based purely on the peer-reviewed literature. And of course, a group like the Academy of Sciences, the IPCC, they've only got one asset really too, which is their reputation. In the case of the Australian Academy of Sciences, it's the reputation of every scientist in Australia, really, rests with that academy. So they don't do things lightly. And if it would really be worthwhile, I think, to read their statement on climate science. It's written in plain English. It's out there for everyone to see. And it's not just the Australian Academy that's done that, but every other major scientific academy around the world. Now, if you stray outside that basis, what you do get is opinion. And, of course, even scientists who've published in the peer-reviewed literature can express an opinion, but it's not part of that basic tested body of science. So there are scientists who'll give you an opinion on an area well outside their area of expertise sometimes. They embarrass all of us on occasion by doing that, but that's just the way of the world. So if you want to engage in a debate on climate science, I think you've got to do your due diligence. You've got to look at the audited accounts. That means looking at the Australian Academy of Sciences position or some other reputable authority, rather than depend on opinion. Because if you listen to the radio or you listen to any other media or whatever, you'll get opinion. Yeah, and that can be interesting and important and enlightening, but without a firm understanding of the scientific basis that the peer review process gives us, it's not a credible a foundation by itself for an opinion on climate change.
Thank you for that, Tim. Yes, thank you. And then I'd like to ask Susanna a question about that matter. Leslie?
Just to add to that, as a scientist working in the climate change area, I often think that climate change scientists are a really peculiar bunch. For all sorts of reasons that I won't go into, but one of the main reasons is that I think collectively we're the only scientists that wake up every day and hope that we're wrong. And I couldn't say that about any other scientist, because if we are wrong, then that red bit of the graph that I showed you won't happen. And if we're right, it may well happen. And none of us want to see that. So we're not out here trying to scare people, but we are trying to make people feel concerned.
And I'll just remind people too that all of the commissioners are independent. This is an independent commission. They're not there to peddle somebody else's views. And I think that their reputations would take a huge downfall if that were to be the case. And that's something certainly to keep in mind. But Susanna, I just wanted to ask you, before we get a microphone to this gentleman here who wants to ask a question, does that make the internet then a godsend and also a nightmare? Because anybody can put anything on the internet and suddenly we think, oh look, that virtually looks like it's in print.
Yes, well, I mean, you know, the internet has been wonderful. I mean, in some ways it's fantastic because it means that people can actually go to sources beyond the media. So in that sense, you know, provided you go to credible sources, and I guess that's the crux of the issue, is that when you're looking on the internet, you really have to look very closely at who is providing this information. And the first place I always go is the About Us page to find out who's sponsoring this organisation, where is the information coming from, and does it come from the peer-reviewed literature. So I think it's incredibly important that people are very careful about the information they receive from the internet. But of course it also provides a wonderful opportunity for people to give opinion, to express concern. But I do think it's really important that we don't get the sense that the blogs and the opinions out there necessarily represent the entire population. Often they can be quite anxious, and they can be, opinions that are expressed are quite often emotional. And it doesn't necessarily mean that just because somebody's written a vitriolic blog that's how the entire population feels on the issue. I think we have to be very careful about that. It doesn't represent public opinion.
Yeah, I always think that, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? We would never let anybody other than an accredited mechanic work on our car. And yet, you know, you'll have 12 brothers and sisters who'll say, oh, I reckon it's this, and it's the ball bearings, and it's all of that. You know, but they don't have the experience. They don't, you know, have the training.
Yeah. I think, just on that, actually, what really I find very interesting is that in most fields of science, there are small groups of scientists who have a different opinion. And I think that's quite normal. And there's no problem with listening to those scientists to the extent that they represent the scientific community. And a good analogy that quite a lot of people use is if you think about your own health, and if you go to get a medical opinion and you're told that you have a severe illness, you might want to get a second opinion, you might want to get a third opinion. Very few people will go to 98 other experts, but they might.
Yeah.
But if you did, and out of those 100 experts that you go to, 98 of them are saying the same thing to you, and 2 of them are saying, oh no, you haven't got a terminal illness, don't worry about it, just go home, forget about it.
Yeah.
Then who would you listen to? Would it be the 98 or would it be the 2?
I know you want to ask a follow-up question, but I do want to introduce a new topic, and we have a gentleman down here who's waiting.
Thank you. Thank you, Verity. My name is Peter Murphy. I represent the Preston Environment Group, which is a local community group. Professor Brendan Mackey from the Australian National University has come out with some exciting research which claims that mature eucalyptus forest, 1 hectare, could store the equivalent of around 5,500 tonnes of CO2, which is the equivalent of taking at least 1,200 cars off the road per annum. The question is to the panel is that why is the protection of native forest as nature's carbon sinks not mentioned as one of the solutions in combating climate change? Thank you.
Leslie? Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
A point of clarification here. Were you discussing our particular presentation tonight, or just in general about native forest not being a solution?
Tim, it was in, I browsed over the critical decade.
Right, so in our report. Thank you.
Yes.
Good. No, that's good. That's fine.
Look, I totally agree with you, of course, and as I indicated to the question earlier, storing carbon in native trees, preferably in intact landscapes, has lots and lots of benefits, and one of those is taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and the other one is providing habitat for lots of biodiversity. So yes, it's absolutely part of the solution, and we should be promoting both restoration and protection of our native forests at every opportunity.
Susan Hills, Southwest Environment Centre. We're getting a go today. I would like to ask the Climate Commission if they are really convinced that simply pricing CO2 pollution will really help to solve the problem without taking note of the population growth and the subsequent economic growth that will also ensue on world population levels.
Great, interesting question, thank you.
Probably best.
Tim?
I'll have a go at trying to answer that briefly, if I can, which is difficult. There's no jurisdiction anywhere in the world that just uses one approach to deal with climate change. It's not like we can expect a carbon price to do all of the work that's required. And in fact, we have a number of mechanisms even in Australia. We've got the mandated renewable energy target, we've got various state programs, and so forth. So sure, it's very, I think the way that economists express this to me is that it's necessary but not sufficient to have a price on carbon. You need a series of other mechanisms. They include things like perhaps protecting native forests in Australia's case and so forth. Whether all of those things together can add up to an effective response in the face of a growing global population and the growing consumerism that we see and growing affluence around the world is a really, really important question, and no one knows the answer to it. But if I could say in broad terms that the human population, the UN suggests, their projections suggest, will peak at about 9 billion people by 2050. Yeah? And after that, hopefully, we'll start a slow decline. Can the world feed 9 billion people? My gut feeling is it probably can. We're at 7 billion already, and with more sustainable practices, perhaps we can do that. Can we support the growing affluence of the billions in China and India people who aspire quite rightly to the sort of lifestyle that we enjoy today? That's a more difficult question. And I think, at least in terms of the climate issue, a lot of the response to that is going to come around the technology issues. After all we want is the light provided, the service that the light gives us this evening with these lights. We don't care whether that's coming necessarily from the burning of coal or from wind in terms of our amenity, you know. So as we move forward, I think we'll see much greater efficiency and a shift to a greener economy that at least opens up the potential for those billions to have a reasonable quality of life in future.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to come back to you, sir, but I wouldn't mind them just having a bit of global warming in here tonight, really. It's freezing, isn't it? Gentleman at the end in the brown shirt, and are they braces?
My name is Ziggy, and I'm burgher of this town. I'm living in South Bunbury. Question to the panel. I live long enough. I was working already on computers in 1964. In this time, in all papers was that by the year 2000, icebergs will be actually at London and somewhere close to the South France. Today, you are saying totally reverse, that we will have no ice. Is climatology actually a science or belief system? If we go further, Copernicus was a single guy which said that Earth is turning around the sun, not the other way around. You are telling me at the moment at 5 that CO2 is only a reason why temperature rise. Scientists in Germany...
If you could just bring it down a little bit so that we could get to the point. Is the question actually, is science...
Yes.
Is science...
Is climatology a science or a belief system? Because at the moment looks like it's belief.
Thanks for your question, Ziggy.
Yeah, look, very good question. I would argue absolutely it's a science because it actually makes progress, and in so doing it falsifies earlier ideas as new data come in. There was an idea around 30 or 40 years ago that the Earth might be going into a new ice age. It was very interesting how that was pieced out, that there's going to be a long delay in that. Those earlier comments that you quoted were done before we had ice core records, before we drilled down into Antarctica and Greenland, and actually got records of how the Earth has really behaved over the last 400 or so thousand years. And what we find is that normally the warm periods in between the ice ages, this goes about 100,000 year cycles, are an order of 5 to 10,000 years. So on that basis, quite rightly, scientists said, well, we should be going into another ice age, icebergs near London, all this sort of thing. What they didn't account for, and interesting you mentioned Copernicus, was that the Earth's orbit this time around the sun is a little bit more circular, which means that it spends a little bit longer nearer to the sun, so the warm period is actually elongated. And this happened about 600,000 years ago. We see it in the ice core record. So it's definitely a science because it's learning as it's going, it's progressing, and now we have a very good understanding that the present warm period would last about 20 or 30,000 years if humans wouldn't be pushing it even warmer. So yes, very definitely climate science is indeed a science. In fact, it's many sciences: meteorology, oceanography, terrestrial ecology, paleosciences, and so on.
Lovely. Thank you, Will.
Thanks, Verity. Roy Scaife of Australand. And I've got two related questions. When I registered, I was asked if I had any questions to present to the Commission, and so I did put a question in. So should I just go ahead with that question now?
I hope it is, because I've got it here. Most people who've put some thought into the effects of climate change feel that Australia should not act until countries like the US, China and India take action. How do we answer these concerns? Is that...
Yeah, that's right. Basically what I'm going to say is that I try to talk to a lot of people who are what I'd call are not true believers in climate change, and that's the answer that I get more times than I'd care to. And whilst I've got an answer, or a series of them, I'd just like to know what the Commission suggests that is the answer to that question.
And Roy, it is an important one. A lot of people are answering. Why should we make a difference if we're hardly producing any emissions?
Well,
yes.
you know,
who would like to?
the thing about that is the entire premise of that question is just wrong. It assumes other people aren't doing anything, and that's not right. We know that in the case of the US, for example, they've committed to a minus 17% target, so to reduce their emissions by 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. And they're on track to achieve that. Now, part of it's the economic slowdown, but part of it's good policy as well. Canada's doing the same thing. They've got the same target, and despite the fact the federal government's not doing much, there's a lot happening at the provincial level, and so they're on track to achieve their target. The others were China and India, I think, were the two mentioned in the question. India's introduced a carbon tax. It's a little bit over a US dollar a tonne at the moment, I think about $1.50 a tonne, and are also pursuing other initiatives in energy efficiency and so forth. China has done a tremendous amount, both in terms of the deployment of renewable energy and also in terms of what they call energy, kind of reducing the amount of CO2 they put out for each unit of production that they generate. And there's a shift in China away from more fossil fuel-based power plants through to renewable energy, and they're quite aggressive targets. So there is action being taken by a lot of people in a lot of nations around the world. They're all somewhat different, but together they add up to a very significant promised reduction in emissions. Lord Stern has estimated that if you take all of the pledges made under the Copenhagen Accord, you get about 2/3 of the avoided emissions that we need, not to put into the atmosphere in order to avoid dangerous climate change. So there is a lot of action happening. Australia is doing our bit, and it's very important in a situation like that where people have made national pledges that they honour them, because if one country defaults on its pledge, everyone else quite rightly turns around and say, well, why are we bothering?
Yeah.
But as it is at the moment, the nations are on track to achieve those pledges.
Leslie's got a follow-up.
If I could add a couple of things to that. Australia, of course, has the highest per capita emission rate in the world. It's about 28 tonnes for each of us per year, far higher than almost anywhere else. And it's true that our total emissions are only about 1.5, 2%. But we're actually at about number 15 or 16 in the world, and there are 170 odd countries that produce less absolute emissions than we do. So, it's a question of ethics and morals and leadership. If we can't, with our stable economy and our education level and all of the advantages that we have, if we can't do something and show the world that we can do it, well then the question is, why should anybody else? And so there's both the practical things that Tim mentioned, that other countries are indeed doing a lot, but there's also a lot of reasons why we should be doing our bit as well.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Absolutely. Thank you. This lady here is next. If you'd like to stand up and again say that. I want to ask Susanna a question in a moment about... I'll wait to see what this question's about, in case I preempt. Sorry, Roy, I stole your
My
question.
name is Maggie Kennedy Piper. I'm from Bunbury, but I also consider myself a citizen of the earth. I'm just interested in any comment you might have to make. If we go down the pathway of a carbon tax and the Australian consumer, and the majority of Australian consumers will be compensated, my concern is, I'm a consumer, as most people are consumers, what will motivate them to use less energy?
Will?
I'm going to be Roger Beale for the moment because Roger's the economist and he gets this question a lot. It's a really, really good question. But the point is, you will still see that price, even though you're compensated for it. They don't take the price away. It comes in unattached to that price. So you don't have to use that money to pay for your extra electricity bill. A lot of people would say, if I can actually reduce my electricity usage, I've got some more money I can use for something else. So the idea is that you still have a price signal, which still, as economists say, gives you that signal to change behavior. But you can benefit then in different ways. Now, just to clarify, the way that system is set up, most of that money is going to go to the lower income people who legitimately will have trouble when they see higher electricity prices or higher prices for other products that have a large carbon intensity. So the idea is if they don't have any other alternative, they need to be able to make ends meet. But the basic principle is there. You will still see that price signal, even though you're compensated.
Tim?
I might just add a point to that too. If you look at what the government has done with trade-exposed industries, it's a similar sort of model, and you see this elsewhere in the world too. So in Australia's case, the government has proposed that they will compensate what are called trade-exposed industries, like aluminium smelters and petrol refineries and so forth, with a certain amount of money. Now, what they've said in those cases is, okay, if you reduce your emissions anyway, you get to keep that money. We're not going to take it away from you. It's a bit like mum saying, here's $20 for lunch. If you only spend 15, you can keep the other 5. You know.
I want
so
your mum, $20 for lunch?
Well, it's a modern era, Verity, I'm afraid. But there's mechanisms there that even though they're sort of on the surface they don't look as if they're are causing action to reduce emissions, in fact will over time. At least they'll provide the opportunity for that to happen.
Okay, thank you for that, Tim. We've got to go to this, there's a man here in just a moment. But Susanna, I just wanted to ask you, before you ask your question, but please feel free to take the microphone to be ready. I wanted to ask you, lots of people will say, uranium, that doesn't have emissions. Why aren't we heading more towards that area? How does that compare with carbon modes of fuel?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that, actually. I would think either Tim or Will.
Or Will?
Look, I'd just say stop talking about uranium, and if you believe it's going to work, get out and do something. Invest some money and start the thing off. Why keep on putting it in the atmosphere as some sort of thing you expect other people to do?
Okay, anybody here? Leave now. Just, all right. This gentleman here, yes.
My name's Michael Casney. I'm with the Bustleton Environment Centre. A lady behind touched on what I wanted to talk about, and that is population control. And I have 2 small questions on that. One is, why do we never hear all these scientists and all the other scientists talking about it? I mean, population is the underlying cause of global warming. You can't go past that. And we don't touch on it, we don't mention it. It's never mentioned in the paper. Okay. All we see in the paper is a woman who's had 15 kids and she's applauded.
So you'd like to say, okay, that's the first question. Why aren't we talking about population?
Why don't the scientists bring population forward as an item and keep pushing it? Yeah. The second part is, should we introduce a carbon tax of $10,000 on anyone who deliberately has more than 2 children? Thank you.
Goodness me, I feel like we're in China. You clearly never had to push a baby out. Anyway, thank you for the question.
Oh, wow.
Who would like to approach population issues? Although Tim certainly did. Tim certainly did say before that there are so many different angles.
That's a really good question. I'll only make 2 comments on that. The first one is, if you actually look at the data, and here I'm going to look at the post-World War II data. If you remember that graph I showed at the beginning, where the 2 graphs of just natural variability and the extra CO2 driving climate change, when those diverged was about that time. So if you look at that time, population has gone up 3 or 3.5-fold from 2 billion to 6 to now 7 billion. But consumption has gone up dramatically more. So if you actually look at what's driving the increase in CO2 emissions, population is a factor, but it's overshadowed by consumption. It's a much bigger factor. So that's why most of the emphasis so far has been on technology that changes how we produce the products that we consume, and indeed on our consumption patterns themselves. But you're right, there is no doubt that population is an underlying problem. However, there have been some rapid gains made internationally. Population or fertility rates are dropping in most parts of the world, and as Tim said, we're projecting it to top out between 9 and 10 billion. And it isn't really the control mechanisms of the Chinese model that are most effective. The most effective thing is education and education of women. That's the single most important thing we can do around the world. The second thing is actually bringing people out of poverty. As people come out of poverty, family sizes drop. So I think if we can get on top of these problems, I agree with you, we've got to stabilize population, there's no doubt about that. But the reason it doesn't come up so much is we've got a really acute problem of consumption and the technology that produces it.
Thank you very much, Will. This gentleman here in the cream-coloured jacket.
Thank you, Steve Dillon. I'm a 3rd-generation farmer from this inland here at Donnybrook and also local Shire president. I'm not too sure whether I should be alarmed or glad about the predictions of sea rise, Verity, but when the Swan Coastal Plains flooded in X number of years' time, we'll have beachfront blocks in Dornoch ready for you, okay? But listen, just to be serious about it, obviously I think what I'd like everybody to remember in this room and also hopefully around Australia as well, this is a global challenge. And therefore there's got to be a global solution to it as well. And I think we can all get emotional and, you know, here we are in Western Australia, we're going to save the planet. And I don't think we're not going to. And I think it's kind of been answered, I suppose, by one of the previous questions that was answered. But, you know, the reality is we're doing about 1.4% of the world's CO2 emissions. I think our target is to reduce it by about 5% in the next 10 to 15 years. Now, if you do the maths on that, it's not going to really make much of a difference at all. Now, I can take the leap of faith and, okay, we can put our toe in the water and go ahead as well, but I'm really concerned as a small business owner with my brother on our family farm. My electricity costs are going to go up, my cool store is going to cost more to run, transport's going to cost more as well, and I'm not going to be compensated diddly squat with that. On top, we've got imports and things like that coming as well. So the question is, Verity, it's really, I suppose it's a question of leadership. I understand about doing your bit and providing some leadership as well, but the reality is I've seen it with agricultural tariffs and import tariffs. And free trade. We'll go ahead and lead the rest of the world, and the rest of the world, I'll tell you, sits back and they laugh at you. They think you're an absolute idiot.
So essentially it's what are the economic impacts for agricultural people?
Well, it's also about okay, it's great to show some leadership, some international leadership for a global challenge. Yep. But yeah, just be very, very careful, I suppose. What do we do if we jump in, Tim, and we start ramping up the carbon price and the rest of the world sits back? What do we do?
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. Well, look, are we leading the world is effectively the question there, and the answer to that is we're not in any of the areas that we're putting that we're intending to act at the moment. If you look at a place like Sweden, the carbon tax there is $140 Australian a tonne. It's quite substantial. Even in British Columbia and Canada, the price is now $20, going up to $30 a tonne by 2012. So there's a lot of actions happening around the world. Australia is not leading as such, but everyone is expected under the Copenhagen Accord to do their bit. And I don't think that you're suggesting Australia should default on its pledge there. I presume not. So that's the situation we're in. As far as I'm aware, no one else is intending to default either. The pledges are being met, at least at this stage of the game, and we hope we can move forward that way. But
I guess he's also looking at, though, what are the benefits apart from the moral high ground? What are the benefits?
Sure. Well, do you want to? Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, a lot of people have talked about the 5% reduction target, and is that really meaningful? And we're only 1.5%. So the 1.5% that still puts us in the top 20 emitters in the world. So everyone expects us to do our fair share. The 5%, the way I look at it is that's stepping stone one on a much longer process to basically decarbonize by 2050 or 2060. And you got to start somewhere. And in my view, you got to start somewhere that's achievable. So people start getting confidence. People start investing in different directions and so on. So the idea is that this decade, we start that long journey toward an 80% reduction or more by 2050. And we do that by getting an achievable target. We do that by starting to set investment patterns in different directions toward low or no emission technologies and so on. So we never do the calculation as scientists as to what a 5% reduction in 2020 means, because it's meaningless. It's a first step on that longer journey toward that much deeper reduction target by mid-century.
Thanks, Will. Not thanks to the person with the mobile phone. Leslie, quick response from
yes,
you?
can I just add to that? I sort of look at reducing carbon emissions a little bit like what happens when you go on a diet to lose weight. You know, we often get asked, well, what will 5% do to global temperatures? And to me, that's like saying, if I eat this hamburger or not, what difference will it make to my weight when I'm 65? It's a sort of a non-question. You know, what we're talking about is behavioural change, just like losing weight effectively in a sustainable way, and being healthy is a behavioural change that is ongoing, and denying yourself that first hamburger is the first step along that track. So, you know, I think we have to look long term. As Will said, we have to make a start. The start that we are making is a doable start, but hopefully it will be more effective. The other response to your question, you mentioned that this is a global problem. Indeed it is, but the impacts will be felt locally. And so there are a hierarchy of things to be done. There are global agreements that we should aim for, but there are also local and individual things that we all need to do in order to achieve that global.
I just wanted to pick up with Susanna had a comment then.
I was just going to take Roger's words again. You know, although Australia's emissions are around 1.4, 1.5%, that's actually very similar to a number of other countries like France and Italy. And if all of those countries that are around 1.5% say, oh, well, it's only 1.5%, then, you know, it's really, we're going to be up the creek, basically, if everybody says that.
Thank you for that scientific assessment. I'd like to there's a girl down here, just because you are going to be the most affected because you're clearly young. And we'd like you to grow
just have a baby face. But my name's Michelle. I grew up in the area, work in environmental science area. It's a sort of follow-on to what we've just been talking about. My question is, I see it in a different way. I see only the benefits in adapting to climate change. For instance, I see a price on carbon will turn waste into a product, improve efficiency and make our coal last longer, get us on our bikes so we're more healthy. Why are we always looking at negatives? Why can't we look at the positives and start adapting to this on a big scale?
Hooray, hooray. Thank you. Hooray.
Well, look, I just think that that's the view we hear again and again in regional Australia when we travel around, people who are looking at the opportunity side of this, because there are significant opportunities, particularly for regions in terms of clean energy generation and so forth. And yeah, you're right, it's a voice we perhaps don't hear often enough in the media, but in forums like this, we hear it quite often. And I think the opportunities are only going to become clearer as government policy becomes settled and we start seeing a long-term sort of price signal in place. Then people will know what is achievable and feasible.
The natural human reaction is resistance to change, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
So we go no first, and then maybe, possibly, we're working on it.
Exactly.
We have one question here from a man who's very patient.
Richard Whitner, Bridgetown Greenbushes, Friends of the Forest. Thank you very much for tonight. In broad terms, there are two alternative approaches to reducing carbon by 2020. One of them is a direct action one, and one of them relies on the marketplace to drive this. What about the period from 2020 to 2050? Can a direct action thing work in any way then, or must we rely on a complete market-driven solution?
Michelle, you should answer that. You're the one who's going to be alive then. What about the commissioners?
Well, I put a Roger Beale hat on again. Yes. And Roger ran a roundtable of economists. So I won't comment directly on the direct action thing because it's cutting a little bit close to policy. But what I will say is that economists almost never agree on anything. But one thing that Roger got them to agree on was the fact that market-based mechanisms are the least cost way to get to where you want to go, and probably the most effective way to get to where you want to go. The design around the world, like the emission trading schemes, are for long-term solutions. An example economically of where that's worked very well is the sulfur dioxide, the acid rain problem, where a market-based mechanism was used to get SO2 out of the smokestacks that was causing air pollution, that was causing acidification of lakes and so on. The experience there was they achieved their targets faster and at less cost than they anticipated. In other words, the economists were pretty pessimistic about how creative people really are. And just to echo what the young lady said, once that policy was in place for SO2, the opportunities were there, all the incentives for change behavior were there. People found, hey, this works and we can do it cheaper than we thought, and it's actually a nicer world, so let's go for it. So that's why we're somewhat optimistic that if we get the policy settings right, on the longer term, we will achieve these targets.
Could I just make a broader point there that this issue of looking beyond 2020 is a really important one, and not much work, at least in my opinion, is being done around that, how we go from what will be in 2020 onwards. A classic example of that is Canada, where the provinces have put together very, very effective programs that run all the way from a carbon tax in British Columbia through to phasing out coal in Ontario through to very comprehensive green program in Quebec. But they run up against a brick wall in 2020 because emissions are being pushed down across the Canadian economy with a single exception, which is the tar sands. They'll be adding 10 gigatons of emissions. I think it was megatons of emission over that period. And unless you start putting things in place now to reduce the tar sands emissions, you'll end up in a position by 2020 where there's not much else you can do, and you start going backwards. So as we look out to 2020, we really have to start planning now for some of that, because 8 years is not a very long time to start putting in place those things that we require for the next tranche of our emissions reduction.
I don't quite thank you. I don't quite understand the tar sands.
The tar sands. In Alberta, there is large deposits of petrochemicals, if you want, a tar, which can be turned into petroleum products, but only with immense energy inputs. So people burn natural gas and so forth to do this. It's a very, very carbon-intensive way of producing petrol, basically. And it's a massive growth industry in Canada. It's the one part of the economy that is not really participating in these reductions that are happening elsewhere.
We have desalinisation here in Western Australia, and I wonder why we don't have renewable energy to power it.
Don't you? I was naively assuming that wind energy was powering the...
We've got a lot of wind energy in
plants.
Albany. Is anybody from Albany? Albany's fantastic. 75% of the electricity generated for Albany is from wind turbines. But I don't think they are.
Well, just make a quick comment. The Sydney one is, because the wind farm is just outside of Canberra. We can see it just outside the city. It was put there expressly to account for the additional electricity for their desal plant.
Am I wrong on that?
The binning up one near here only uses a very small amount of renewable energy.
Okay.
Great.
Okay,
no, not great. A small amount of renewable energy, so we need to work on that. Yeah,
right.
Okay. One of the things, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to almost 7 o'clock, and we have encountered a lot of your questions, and the gentleman here in the brown jacket, I know that Tim really wants to come back and talk with you, but I wanted to include a lot of other topics, which we have done, but please seek him out in the foyer, because we're going to join together for refreshments, and he was the one who said, let's talk again to that gentleman, so he will. So I don't want you to feel as though you have been dismissed at all. I know some of you will be frustrated because you didn't get your questions in, but as you can see, we got as many questions as we could in that particular time. Can I say, just before I invite Professor Flannery to do a little wind-up of tonight, thank you. You were a fantastic audience. You were perfectly civil, perfectly intelligent, perfectly wonderful, and hopefully it'll be the best forum that the country has seen so far. So thank you for helping us out so much already. And will you please welcome Professor Flannery?
Thanks. Well, thanks so much, Verity. I don't think we've ever had such a great compere and such a great audience. It's been a really broad-ranging series of questions. We've certainly learnt a lot as climate commissioners through coming here today, and I look forward to learning more over a cup of tea or coffee afterwards. But once again, thank you for coming. It's tremendously important. Could I just suggest that if you want to do something else around this issue, just take back the discussions that we've had tonight to your friends and family and associates. One of the ways the Climate Commission works is to try to just spread the message through doing exactly that. We can only speak face-to-face to small groups, but as some of the information that we've discussed this evening ripples out through the community, that's when you start to get real understanding and real change. So thank you very much for being part of that important process. To set such a body up. And we're a bit peculiar, and I just want to take a few moments to explain what we do and what we don't do. We are independent from government, so we don't do the government's bidding and we don't report back to government. We're a bit like, I suppose, the judiciary or the Reserve Bank or whatever, in that we're funded by the government, but we're independent of them. We decided early on that we wouldn't comment on government policy, nor opposition policy, because there's a million opinions out there and you can get them anytime you turn on a TV or radio on issues of policy. We saw little point in doing that, and we thought that if we gave away really the power to comment on policy, what we hoped to gain was the authority to be heard as a credible, independent voice in terms of this climate issue. And that's what's really important in the longer term. The Climate Commission's view about this is that this issue is going to be with us for many decades, and that in a democracy, the only way that we'll be able to deal with these problems successfully is if we have a well-educated public who understands the issues and who can make the right sorts of decisions. So we have a rather long-term view of that. We're not focused so much on policy. You can ask questions about policy, but we may not be able to answer them, at least in that direct way. So that's what we do. That's who we are, rather. We have three basic products. We have a website, we have reports, and we'll be presenting one of our reports to you this evening. Professor Will Stephan has produced a report called The Critical Decade, which deals with the science of climate change, and we'll give you an overview of that. That report really underlines another aspect of the way we work. We understand the importance of bipartisanship in the climate issue for a number of reasons, and when we presented our science report to the Australian Federal Parliament on May 23rd this year, it did receive bipartisan support. Both major parties recognised it as being the basis, the proper basis, scientific basis from which to deal with this issue. And that's just, it is hugely important. Every time you get that sort of support, you get so much more certainty, so much more community buy-in, and so much more acceptance of the message. So one of the things we try to do is work in that way. Just take the most reputable, authoritative material and reflect that in the things that we convey to the public. We also, of course, do forums like this. Typically we'll turn up in a region, we'll go out and visit a business, we might have a business breakfast, we might...
out in Iowa. And we had one, in the 3 years I was in high school, we had one school excursion. And the one school excursion was to an abattoir in Sioux City, Iowa. So I thought, I've got to get out of this place and do something different with my career. And so I ended up down here at ANU way back in the 1970s, then CSIRO. But one of the things that really struck me was when I was working on an international program about 15 years or so ago on climate change, I started to see the first evidence coming in from the ice cores of what the climate has done in the past. And then I looked at where we might be going in the future, and I said, oh my goodness, this looks like we could be headed into something as drastic as an ice age, but in the opposite direction. This is a pretty serious issue. So after that, I became really interested in communicating it, working on the policy aspects and so on. That eventually took me to the Commission.
Great. I must say it's an awesome thought that abattoir work was that was what drove you into climate science, but there we go. Anyway, look, our final commissioner who's with us this evening is Professor Leslie Hughes from Curtin University. Leslie's an expert on adaptation and impacts of climate change on biodiversity. And again, I'd just be really interested to hear why you got into the area, Leslie.
Well, I did my PhD actually on ants and ant behaviour, and after 4 years of following ants around the bush, I was pretty over that, and I was casting around, believe it or not, I know, hard to believe, I was casting around for something else to work on, and my PhD supervisor at the time, and this was about 20 years ago, said, you know, I think climate change might be an interesting issue, and I thought, yeah, that might be something in that. And that was 20 years ago, and I've been working in climate change ecology ever since, and it's one of those topics that once you get into it, it becomes almost a moral imperative to stay in it, because when I first started working on climate change, the impacts of climate change on biodiversity seem to be a long way off, and it's become very apparent in the last decade that they're actually here with us now, so that's why I've stayed in it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my journey to being in this is, I guess, a bit similar to all of yours. I started off in paleontology and modern mammals in the Pacific Islands, and I remember climbing mountain after mountain in Papua New Guinea because I was really interested in the things that lived right in the alpine grassland on the top of the mountain. And I noticed that no matter which mountain I climbed, I saw the same thing, that the tree line was rising, the vegetation was coming up. And I was stupid enough not to actually sort of twig to this, that this was a real fingerprint of climate change. I just thought, oh, perhaps people are burning.
Will evict you if you get out of hand. In a very loving, caring kind of way, though. Now, as we know, WA is a very different part of the world to the rest of the world. I always think we are so different, and we have very specific climate issues here that the climate commissioners will deal with too. You'll hear about that very shortly too. But we've got a whole heap of things on our plate that we need to make some decisions about, but that we also need to learn about before we can make those decisions. So soon you'll hear about their research, and then they'll happily take some brief questions. Just before I bring Professor Tim Flannery back into it, I'll just give you the heads up now. We would like brief questions. There are a lot of you here tonight, and obviously we want to get through as many questions as we possibly can. So we don't want statements, we want some questions so that we can really get into the discussion and learn so much more. So let's now introduce the man I know is a fan, or is the star to many of you anyway, Professor Tim Flannery. He's the Chief Climate Commissioner. He's one of Australia's leading writers, of course, on climate change. He is an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer, conservationist. Professor Flannery was named Australian of the Year in 2007. Yes. And as I remember, I think you immediately turned to the then Prime Minister and said, "Don't expect me to agree with you on everything." He's held various academic positions, including Professor at the University of Adelaide, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum, Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University, and the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. I've got it underlined to say it properly. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please help me make Professor Tim Flannery very welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Verity, for that introduction. It's embarrassed me slightly, actually. But it's fantastic to be here with you this evening. We're really pleased to see so many people out on what is a pretty chilly, windy evening, and appreciate you coming here. This really is your evening, because the Climate Commission is set up to help provide, well, to engage with you, really, to engage with the Australian public. The Climate Commission was originally, it resulted from a promise by the federal government. Meet the Lions Club, we might meet people from a school or a university, and then come on to a forum like this. And by the time we arrive at the forum, we've usually got a fairly good idea about what's happening in the local community. Unfortunately, our schedule this time hasn't permitted us to visit a business in the Bunbury area prior to this meeting, but we do look forward to hearing from you about business perspectives in terms of the climate issue. I'd like to just say a few more words about our climate commissioners who are here, and ask them to really introduce themselves for you, but also to introduce one of our visitors. Bruce Thom, Professor Bruce Thom, is in the audience here. Bruce is travelling with us at the moment. He's the chair of the federal government's Coastal Climate Committee, and is an expert in areas of sea level rise and so forth. So if you have any questions in that area, Professor Thom, I'm sure, will be happy to answer them. We have two commissioners who are not with us this evening. Unfortunately, Jerry Houston, who has recently stepped down as the president of BP Australasia. He's one of our commissioners. He's stuck in Queenstown in a blizzard, trying to drink his way out of it, as we understand, with some good Pinot Noir. But yes, we wish him the best in that. And Roger Beale, our economist, who was last seen in the East India Club in London, dispensing advice there over a gin and tonic, but he's with us for most of our events, but unfortunately can't be with us this evening. The three commissioners who are here are Susanna Elliott at the end here, and Susanna is an expert in really science communication. And I thought I'd just ask you, as I introduce you all, why you joined the Commission. How did you get involved with the climate issue? So perhaps one after the other you could...
Well, you asked me, Tim.
Yes.
That was... Now, I think for me, I'm actually a bit of a generalist, really. I'm working across lots of different fields of science. It might be vaccinations one day, it might be climate change the next. And, I just realised that there was a huge scientific consensus in climate science, which I felt wasn't getting through. And so I felt that message really needed to get through, and that's really why I joined the Commission.
Okay, thanks. That's good. And I know, Will, you've got a particular path to get to where you've got to, and you are, I should say for the audience, one of the most respected climate scientists on the planet. And at ANU, how did you end up getting involved with things?
Yeah, well, it actually goes way back to my childhood. I was born and raised in the middle of America, which you'll probably find out fairly quickly if you haven't already from my accent. And we lived in a fairly small, poor town.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our discussion, our conversation on better managing our lives within this climate and seeing what we can do as individuals and as a collective too to better manage this earth on whom we depend. My name is Verity James, and I am so delighted to be the facilitator for our forum tonight. This is going to be a real learning experience. It's a real opportunity for every single person here. And I suspect even for the climate commissioners too, because they're here to listen to your concerns, to your questions, as well as share their amazing knowledge. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Noongar people, on whose land we meet today, and thank them for their custodianship over so many centuries. And our climate commissioners today will be, of course, Professor Tim Flannery. Also, yes, feel free. Cheering is acceptable as well. Also, Professor Leslie Hughes. Professor Will Stephan. And Dr. Susanna Elliott. And you'll get to find out a little bit more about them and why they've taken on this incredible role in a short while from now. Look, I'd really like to thank you so much for coming out on what's probably freezing outside at the moment, is it? Whenever it drops. No? Yeah, well, it certainly was today, coming down from Perth, you know, with the hail and the rain and all of that sort of thing. So I love that you have come out tonight. It just shows how much you care about the future, that you really want to take part in this constructive conversation. Clearly, as I mentioned, we have an intelligent audience and I hope a courteous audience. Now, these climate issues, as we know, evoke passions like almost nothing else, and they should. This is about our very existence. This is about what our planet is going to look like, about our survival. And that passion acknowledged, I really do want you to address this in a civilised fashion, as I'm sure you will. I'm glad you came to take part in this conversation, but as much as I love you and care for you, I will